In 1943, a German army doctor working in a field hospital noticed something that should not have been possible. Wounded soldiers who were fed a simple soup made from a common roadside weed recovered from broken bones nearly 40% faster than the men who ate standard military rations. When samples of that weed reached a laboratory in Munich, the analysis explained the mystery. The plant, treated as a nuisance and pulled out of gardens across Europe, contained close to 4 times more calcium than the milk that supply trucks could no longer deliver to the front. By the end of this video, you will know how to find this plant, how to harvest it safely, and how to prepare it so that you may never need to buy a bottle of calcium tablets again. Before we go further, let me ask you something. Have you ever been stung by this plant as a child, brushing past it in tall grass, and remembered the burn for hours afterward? Leave it in the comments, because almost everyone has a story about it, and almost nobody knows that the plant that hurt them is one of the most nourishing things growing in their region. Now, walk into any pharmacy near you and look at the supplement shelf. You will see rows of calcium tablets, bottle after bottle, priced somewhere between $15 and $30 each. The companies that make them spend enormous sums convincing people that a pill formulated in a factory is better for your bones than anything that could grow on its own outside your door. Shoppers load these into their baskets, trusting that a processed capsule must be superior. Almost none of them stop to wonder whether soldiers patching up shattered legs in muddy field hospitals 80 years ago had already stumbled onto something better and cheaper. The plant is stinging nettle. It grows on every continent except Antarctica. In good soil, it can reach the height of a grown person, and it spreads underground through creeping roots that shrug off winter frost and come back stronger every spring. Most people first meet it through pain, a bare ankle dragged through a patch of it, or a careless handful grabbed while playing in an overgrown field. The burning that follows can linger for hours, and it leaves an impression that lasts for years. That sting is not an accident. It comes from thousands of tiny hollow hairs that cover the leaves and stems. Under a microscope, these hairs look and behave like miniature needles. When your skin touches them, the fragile tips snap off and inject a small cocktail of chemicals straight into your flesh. One compound triggers immediate swelling, another amplifies the nerve signals so the sensation spreads, and a third, the same acid that fire ants use, keeps the burning going long after contact. This is a defense system that took millions of years to evolve, and it exists to drive away insects, grazing animals, and curious hands alike. Here is the part worth pausing on. A plant does not pour that much biological energy into protecting itself unless there is something inside worth protecting. The nettle is guarding a treasure, and human beings figured that out a very long time ago. Records from a monastery in the 9th century show it clearly. Benedictine monks in what is now Switzerland kept careful garden plans, and nettle appears on them right alongside their medicinal herbs. These were not weeds that slipped in by mistake. The monks were deliberately growing a food that carried whole communities through the lean months of winter, when the stored grain ran thin and there was little else to eat. Centuries later, an English botanist compiling the plant knowledge of his time described nettle as deeply nourishing in seasons of hunger. He recorded that highland communities in Scotland lived through brutal winters by gathering nettle from sheltered valleys when every other source of food had failed. During the Irish famine years in the middle of the 19th century, the same pattern repeated. Families who still remembered the old foraging skills folded nettle into soups and porridges, while the potato crop rotted in the ground. The plant grew thick in exactly the disturbed soil where desperate people had torn up their failed fields. During the First World War, the British government printed official pamphlets urging people to go out and harvest wild nettle. Those documents, still kept in a war museum, laid out how to collect it and how to cook it to stretch the meager wartime rations. Government botanists understood perfectly well that this plant, growing along railway banks and in bomb craters, held nutrients that imported food simply could not supply. But the most detailed records of all come from the Second World War. Field hospitals on the Eastern Front were starved of supplies, and medical officers were forced to experiment with whatever local food they could find. The doctor stationed near the fighting in 1943 watched his nettle-fed patients knit their bones back together faster than the men on ordinary food. His observations traveled up through military channels to laboratories in Munich and Berlin, and the analysis there confirmed what he had seen in the wards. The plant held calcium in amounts that seemed almost impossible for a wild weed. That research ended abruptly when Allied bombing tore apart German scientific facilities in 1944. And after the war, the knowledge simply scattered. It was never gathered up and preserved. The agricultural offices of Europe and North America threw all their energy into rebuilding food production through industrial farming. That approach demanded purchases, fertilizer from chemical plants, seeds from seed companies, machinery from manufacturers. Every one of those purchases pumped money into the economy and helped fund the recovery. The old foraging wisdom, passed hand to hand across generations, generated no revenue for anyone selling anything. Grandparents who could name every wild plant that had once fed their families found that knowledge brushed aside as backward and primitive. Their grandchildren learned instead to buy vegetables wrapped in plastic. The chain of memory snapped in a single generation. And so the plant that had carried Europe through every famine in its history was reclassified as a noxious weed to be wiped out. County offices printed guides on how to kill it with chemicals. Gardeners sprayed herbicide along their fences wherever it appeared. The most nutrient-dense food in the temperate world became something to destroy rather than something to gather. But the science never went away. It kept quietly accumulating in research journals that ordinary people almost never open. As laboratory methods grew more precise, researchers kept measuring what was actually inside these leaves, and their findings backed up everything the old records claimed, while turning up benefits the medieval monks could never have measured. A detailed nutritional study published in 2013 measured the mineral content of nettle grown under controlled conditions. The calcium reading came in at 481 milligrams per 100 grams of dried leaf. The same measurement for whole milk sits at 125. That works out to roughly 3.8 times more calcium in the weed than in the dairy product that marketing has spent decades promoting as the ultimate food for strong bones. But raw content is only half the story. Calcium that your digestion cannot break down and absorb does you no good, no matter how much of it there is. A separate analysis of absorption studies found that the calcium in nettle enters the bloodstream at about 40% efficiency, while the calcium in dairy absorbs at closer to 30%. So the plant not only delivers more calcium per serving, your body also grabs a higher share of what it delivers. 1 cup of cooked nettle provides more usable calcium than 2 full glasses of milk. The arithmetic is simple. It just happens to contradict 50 years of dairy advertising that most people accepted without ever questioning it. Now, the obvious objection. People drink milk, but who is going to sit down and eat a dried weed? The answer comes down to basic kitchen chemistry. Boiling nettle in water for about a minute completely destroys the sting. The heat breaks apart the irritating proteins and neutralizes the chemicals inside those needle-like hairs. What remains tastes much like spinach, with a slightly deeper, more mineral flavor. Every traditional nettle dish, from Scottish soup to the meals cooked in German field hospitals, begins with that brief cooking that turns a painful weed into a perfectly pleasant green. The protein content surprised the researchers as much as the calcium did. A 2016 study measured protein at somewhere between 25 and 30% of the dry weight. To put that in perspective, spinach comes in under 3% and kale around 4%. Soybeans, the backbone of the plant protein industry, sit near 36%. Nettle climbs almost to soybean levels while growing as an unwanted weed rather than a carefully farmed crop. And it is a complete protein. Your body needs 9 essential amino acids that it cannot build for itself, and these have to come from food. Animal products usually supply all 9, while most plants are missing 1 or more. Nettle leaves carry all 9 in proportions your body can actually use. The medieval populations who survived on nettle through times of scarcity were not merely lucky. They were eating a complete protein source that modern nutrition science would not fully understand for another 800 years. The plant worked long before anyone could explain why. Iron tells a similar story, one that also complicates what many of us learned as children. Every kid who grew up watching a certain spinach-eating cartoon sailor came away believing spinach was the ultimate source of iron and strength. Fresh spinach does contain a fair amount of iron, and fresh nettle contains a little less. But the numbers mislead. Spinach carries compounds that bind its iron into a form human digestion largely cannot absorb. So much of it passes straight through you untouched. Nettle contains far less of those binding compounds, which means its iron stays available for your body to use. What matters is not what a laboratory measures in the raw leaf, but what you can actually absorb from it. Then there is vitamin K, where nettle provides several times the adult daily requirement in a single serving. This matters enormously for bones, because vitamin K is what allows calcium to be deposited into the bone structure in the first place. A food that is simultaneously loaded with calcium and vitamin K explains, in a single sentence, the faster healing that army doctors watched with amazement in their hospital wards. So the question becomes impossible to ignore. Why does a plant that we treat as a worthless weed hold more nutrition than crops that farmers tend with great care and shoppers pay premium prices to buy? The answer lies in evolution and in agricultural history. Wild plants live under constant assault. Insects chew their leaves, animals graze their stems, diseases invade their tissue. To survive, they have to pour resources into defensive chemistry and into the concentrated nutrients that let them repair themselves quickly. Plants that could not defend and heal simply did not survive to reproduce, and over millions of years, natural selection packed the survivors with beneficial compounds. Cultivated crops faced an entirely different set of pressures. Humans selected plants for the traits that pleased farmers and merchants, not the traits that nourished eaters. Bigger fruit sold better at market. Sweeter flavor pleased tongues raised on sugar. Tougher skins survived long shipping journeys. Seeds that sprouted all at once made planting simpler. Not one of those goals had anything to do with nutritional density. In fact, studies tracking supermarket produce over 50 years have documented steady declines, tomatoes with a fraction of the vitamin C they once held, broccoli with half the calcium. The crops on our shelves look beautiful and taste fine while quietly delivering less and less real nourishment each decade. Nettle never went through any of that. No seed company ever bred it for the supermarket. No farm office ever tuned it for machine harvesting. It kept its original density precisely because no business had any reason to breed that density out of it. The same thing that stopped anyone from commercializing it is exactly what preserved the value that domesticated crops threw away. There is more. Nettle actually pulls heavy metals out of contaminated soil, storing them in its roots while keeping its edible leaves clean. This is why it flourishes in abandoned lots, old industrial sites, and roadsides soaked in decades of exhaust. It grows in ruined ground because its biology can handle conditions that would poison ordinary vegetables. Calling it a weed says nothing about the plant and everything about our failure to recognize that adaptation as a gift. The growing economics border on the ridiculous. As a crop, nettle can produce more dry matter per acre than alfalfa, the traditional gold standard, and it does so without any nitrogen fertilizer because it reaches soil nitrogen through pathways that farmed crops lack. Its seeds sprout in under 2 weeks. The plants are ready to cut about 8 weeks later, and a single established patch keeps producing for 5 to 7 years without any replanting. Compare that to the store shelf. A monthly calcium supplement runs $15 to $30, which adds up to a couple $100 a year or more for a single mineral that grows freely in your yard. A small patch, perhaps 10 square feet, will hand you 20 pounds or more of fresh greens every year once it takes hold. Dried nettle sells at health food stores for a serious price per pound, so that little patch quietly produces a couple $100 of value from plants that ask for no fertilizer and no watering beyond the rain. Getting started could hardly be simpler. Nettle thrives exactly where your other plants fail. The shady corner where lawn grass gives up, the low damp spot where water pools after a storm. These frustrate most gardeners, but delight nettle. Root divisions taken from an existing patch cost nothing if a neighbor is willing to share. Or you can buy starter plants or a packet of seeds for a few dollars. Set the divisions about a foot apart and a couple of inches deep. Water them once, and then leave them alone. This is a plant that evolved to survive without you. Fussing over it wastes effort better spent elsewhere. Begin harvesting once the plants stand about a foot tall. Snip off the top few inches of each stem with scissors or shears. The sting fades within seconds of cutting, as the pressure inside those tiny hairs collapses, so within half a minute you can handle the cut stems with bare hands and feel nothing. Gloves offer peace of mind, but no real necessity for material you have already cut. Preparing it for the table takes 1 minute. Drop the cut nettle into boiling water. Wait 60 seconds, then drain it. The heat wipes out the sting completely and permanently. Cooked nettle keeps in the fridge for about a week and in the freezer for 6 months, and dried nettle stored away from light and moisture keeps almost indefinitely. The traditional recipes stretch across every corner of Europe. There is a Scottish soup that pairs the greens with potato and onion, an Italian dish that swaps it in for spinach with a stronger mineral note, German dumplings that fold the blanched leaves into potato dough. Any recipe that calls for cooked spinach welcomes nettle in its place, with more nutrition to show for it. Beyond the kitchen, the dried powder blends into a smoothie without changing the taste. The leaves steep into a mineral-rich tea, and if you want, you can even fill your own capsules with the dried powder and mirror the supplement industry, using nothing but your own backyard. Because every cut stimulates fresh regrowth from the roots, a single patch keeps producing all season long. Cut it every 3 or 4 weeks, and it will feed you steadily from the last frost of spring to the first frost of autumn. Roughly 8 months of fresh greens, with the dried harvest carrying you through the remaining 4. That army doctor whose findings vanished into a file drawer was never handed some secret. He was handed desperation, and desperation forced him to pay attention to what was growing freely around the rubble. In a quieter form, the same conditions exist today. Climbing supplement prices and thinning produce nutrition create a moment where rediscovering old knowledge pays off in a very practical way. The agricultural offices have no reason to promote a plant that grows without a single purchased input, because the entire structure that funds public farming education is tied to the companies selling seeds, fertilizer, and machinery. Nettle earns those suppliers nothing. The knowledge stayed buried not through any conspiracy, but through an economic system that amplifies some information and ignores the rest, no matter how much value it holds for ordinary people. The research sits in university libraries, open to anyone who cares to look. The historical records fill public archives, and the plant itself grows along roadsides, in vacant lots, and at the edges of parking areas throughout the temperate world. Every gardener who yanks it out and bags it for the trash is throwing away the single highest source of calcium that grows in their climate. The monks understood it. The soldiers rediscovered it. The science has now confirmed it. The most nourishing food around us asks for no money, no cultivation, and no attention at all beyond the willingness to see value where we were taught to see only a weed. If forgotten knowledge like this is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe to the channel and join us in the next video to find out what else has been growing freely all along, waiting for someone to notice.